And finally tonight, a new festival this weekend helps the resurgent elk in the Great Smoky Mountains.
Here's Jim Matheny.
I think there was a lot of skepticism this project would not work, and here we are, nearly 20 years later, and it's a success.
For generations, North Carolina's mountains looked alive. Tourists saw endless green ridges, quiet valleys, and postcard-perfect views along the Blue Ridge Parkway. But beneath that beauty, something was slowly disappearing. The open meadows were closing in. The grasslands were choking under shrubs. The animals that depended on clear ground were vanishing into silence. Then, in 2001, wildlife officials made a decision that sounded almost impossible. They brought back 52 elk. Not machines, not fences, not another expensive restoration project. Just 52 animals stepping out of crates into a landscape that had not heard their bugle in more than 150 years. And what happened next stunned the scientists watching them. Within months, the valley began to change. Meadows opened. Birds returned. Rabbits moved through grass that had once been impossible to cross. Even the soil started creating new habitats. A dying mountain valley was waking up. And the unbelievable part was this: the elk were not just surviving in the Smokies, they were rebuilding them. For nearly 2 centuries, the mountains looked healthy. Hikers walked the ridge lines, tourists drove the Blue Ridge Parkway. The Great Smoky Mountains became the most visited national park in the United States. From a distance, everything seemed alive. But the meadows of Cataloochee were closing. Open valley floors that had existed for thousands of years, once kept clear by large grazing animals, began to thicken. Shrubs pushed into grassland. Grasses tangled and stiffened. The clear sightlines that once let red-tailed hawks hunt and rabbits move across open ground slowly vanished under unchecked vegetation. The mountains were not dying loudly, they were going quiet. And that silence, it turned out, had consequences nobody had fully measured. By the late 1990s, the National Park Service began asking an uncomfortable question: what if the Smokies were missing something essential? The feasibility studies took years. The politics took longer. State veterinarians in North Carolina and Tennessee pushed back. Agricultural interests resisted. Governor James Hunt forced the decision through in the final days of his administration, but he missed his own deadline. The first 25 elk were released into Cataloochee Valley on January 12, 2001, 2 days after Hunt left office. They came from land between the lakes in Kentucky. 27 more followed in 2002, sourced from Elk Island National Park in Alberta, Canada. 52 animals in total. Everyone was fitted with a radio collar. Every movement was tracked. Joe Yarkovich, a wildlife biologist for the National Park Service, set up monitoring stations across the valley. He installed 15 exclosures, small fenced plots designed to compare what grew where elk could graze and what grew where they could not. The plan was simple: release the animals, step back, and wait 10 to 15 years to see whether the ecosystem responded. The ecosystem did not wait. Within the first growing season, the elk spread across the floor of Cataloochee and began grazing in patterns no management plan had anticipated. They were not moving randomly. They worked through the overgrown meadows systematically, cropping grass, pushing through thicket, and opening corridors through vegetation that had been sealed for generations. Where a single elk walked and grazed, the grass stayed short. Where a herd moved through, the ground opened. Bare soil appeared in patches that had not seen direct sunlight in decades. Shallow depressions formed where elk rolled and churned the ground with their bodies. After rain, those depressions filled with water. They became drinking spots for smaller animals, breeding grounds for insects, and microhabitats that had not existed in the valley for over a century. But the most surprising change was not just on the valley floor. The elk changed what lived above it, below it, and beside it. Rangers walking the valley during the first year began reporting things that did not fit the projected timeline. Rabbits were appearing in areas where undergrowth had once been too dense to navigate. Wild turkey were moving through fields that had been impassable. And above the meadows, red-tailed hawks began hunting in patterns that had not been seen in living memory. The shortened grass gave them clear sight lines to the ground for the first time in more than 100 years. Yarkovich described it plainly. The elk were maintaining open habitat that no human management program had managed to sustain. They were doing it continuously and without daily direction. Every day, every season, year after year. The contrast was impossible to ignore. For decades, land managers across the eastern United States had spent millions maintaining grassland with mowing, controlled burns, mechanical clearing, and replanting. The results were modest. The maintenance never ended. But 52 elk were producing the same effect with nothing but hooves and appetite. They were not following a management plan. They were the management plan. Then the data began confirming what the valley was already showing. When the monitoring exclosures were checked, the differences stood out. Plant composition inside the elk-grazed areas was diversifying. The uniform tangle of overgrown grass was becoming a mosaic, patches of short-cropped grassland beside stands of taller vegetation. Edge habitat, absent from Cataloochee for a century, was returning, and where edges appeared, species appeared with them. The exclosures built to measure what elk were taking ended up revealing what they were giving back. Then the herd itself began to grow. The first calf born in Cataloochee Valley in more than 150 years arrived in 2001, the same year as the first release. By 2008, the National Park Service declared the experimental phase a success and handed off management responsibilities outside park boundaries to the North Carolina Wildlife Resources Commission. The estimated population outside the park boundary was around 80 animals, but the early years were not easy. Black bears preyed on calves. Brainworm, a parasite carried by white-tailed deer and lethal to elk, posed a constant threat. In 2003, planned additional releases were put on hold entirely because of fears that chronic wasting disease could enter North Carolina. Scientists expected attrition. They expected the herd to plateau. Some believed the elk might need supplemental releases just to survive. Instead, the population kept growing. In 2022, a research team led by a doctoral candidate at the University of Tennessee, working under wildlife biologist Joseph Clark, completed a DNA-based population study using fecal samples collected across western North Carolina. The result was 240 elk, nearly 5 times the original 52. Nearly 3/4 of the herd was female. Female annual survival rates came in above 95%. The growth rate for female elk from 2020 to 2021 was recorded at 1.559, meaning the female herd was growing by more than 55% per year. The animals that were expected to struggle were thriving. The valley that was supposed to take decades to respond had begun responding within months. But the biggest change came when the elk stopped staying in one place. By the late 2010s, herds had spread beyond Cataloochee to Cherokee, Balsam Mountain, Maggie Valley, and Waynesville. Individual bulls were tracked traveling up to 45 miles from the original release site. Calves were being born across the new ranges. The mountains were not just hosting the elk anymore, they were being reshaped by them, one meadow at a time, one valley at a time, one generation at a time. For visitors driving the Blue Ridge Parkway between Maggie Valley and Cherokee, what had once been an empty stretch of highway became something else. Elk grazed in fields beside the road. Bulls bugled across the valleys in autumn. It was a sound no one living in these mountains had heard before 2001, and one that no one alive will likely ever stop hearing again. That is not a fairy tale. That is documented science. 20 years on, the meadows of Cataloochee are open. The grassland edges are sharp and varied. Red-tailed hawks hunt over ground they can finally see. Wild turkey move through corridors that were closed for 150 years. The bugling of bull elk, a sound that disappeared from these ridgelines sometime around the American Revolution, echoes off the same slopes it echoed off before the Cherokee were displaced, before settlers arrived, before the last elk in North Carolina was killed. 52 animals stepped out of crates into a landscape that had forgotten them. But the landscape, it turned out, had not forgotten what to do with them. The mountains had been waiting, but the elk are not the only species being brought back to reshape American landscapes. In our next video, we travel to a river where a single keystone species, working with nothing but mud and instinct, did what decades of engineering could not. If you thought what happened in the Smokies was unbelievable, wait until you see what happened when this one returned. You will not look at rivers the same way again.